Good evening, everyone, and welcome here this evening to this talk titled Mindfulness, a Key to Happiness. I think we've got about an hour and a half till 8 o'clock, and so what we're going to try to do this evening is a number of things. First off, I'd like to begin by, of course, defining what do we mean by mindfulness, what do we mean by happiness, and then we'll have a look at how mindfulness is a key to that happiness. And then in the middle of this presentation, we'll do a little mindfulness meditation. And then towards the end, we'll look at how to cultivate mindfulness, how to improve our mindfulness so that it can be a key to our happiness. And then I'm going to leave some time at the end for question answer. So that's more or less the schedule for this evening's session. So let's begin. So first off, mindfulness. What do we mean by mindfulness? Mindfulness, of course, is very popular now in the modern world, even become sometimes somewhat trendy. And we need to be clear about what we mean by mindfulness. And so here, mindfulness, of course, is a translation of the original Buddhist words in Sanskrit and Pali. The Sanskrit word is smrti, the Pali word is sati, and both of those words literally mean to remember, memory. So mindfulness is our ability to remember. So how mindfulness is defined in Buddhism, it is the faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. So basically, it's our ability to focus on an object without becoming distracted. This is mindfulness. What we need to realize is that in a lot of the modern day mindfulness traditions, they have redefined the word mindfulness to mean something a little bit different. Often in the modern traditions, you'll hear them say mindfulness is something like a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Very good thing. But this is not how the word mindfulness was originally defined in the Buddhist context. So we need to be aware that there is this now different way of defining the word mindfulness. Otherwise, we can get confused. And on that point, in terms of mindfulness being defined in this way in the modern traditions, again, often it's defined as a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Very good. But often when people hear that, particularly this word non-judgmental, people often misinterpret that to mean everything is okay, accept everything. This is an ethical disaster. Non-judgmental doesn't mean accept everything. Non-judgmental means don't react to things. We have to evaluate things. If someone is behaving badly, we need to evaluate that and not accept it. So be careful when we see this word non-judgmental. Otherwise, people end up accepting everything. This is a disaster. So those are just a little side point. So again, here, mindfulness is, as it's defined in Buddhism, is this faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. What do we mean by happiness? we can talk about two types of happiness: temporal happiness and genuine happiness. Temporal happiness is simply our pleasurable experiences. And our pleasurable experiences, of course, is a stimulus-based happiness, meaning we have to have a certain stimulus to have the pleasurable experience. So this type of happiness is what's called conditioned happiness. We need some sort of condition for us to have this happiness experience. And so what we can understand from this is a transient type of happiness, meaning when the stimulus finishes, the pleasurable experience finishes. And because it's a stimulus-based happiness, it's unreliable, meaning we can't just click our fingers and have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. It requires a certain stimulus. There's no stimulus, there's no pleasant experience. Also, if we look closely at our pleasurable experiences, we will realize, we'll come to see, they're not really even in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasurable experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean that the more we indulged in them, the more we engaged in them, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that's not the case. And that often if we overindulge in our pleasant experiences, they don't bring us more happiness. In fact, they often bring us suffering. Example, eating too much of our favourite chocolate cake, staying too long out in the nice warm sunshine. They don't make us more happy, we end up suffering. So what we can understand is these pleasurable experiences are relative experiences. Relative to some prior state, they're an improvement, but if we overindulge in them, often they just turn into suffering themselves. So this temporal happiness is about what we can get from the world. And of course, it's never enough. And so temporal happiness often ends up in competition for those limited resources that we're all trying to get. And then that can often lead to conflict over those resources. Whereas genuine happiness is simply a state of inner well-being. So genuine happiness is not a stimulus-based happiness. It doesn't require any particular stimulus to be present. So it's what's called unconditioned happiness. Doesn't require any particular condition to be present. And so, of course, this is a much more stable and reliable type of happiness. And this type of happiness is not so much about what we can get from the world, but it's more about what we can bring to the world. So instead of competition, we have cooperation. And so, of course, here, from a Buddhist context, when we talk about striving for happiness, we're mainly talking about the second type, genuine happiness, inner well-being. And often when people hear about this, people feel like it's a choice. Either I choose pleasure or genuine happiness. And often this misunderstanding comes because in Buddhism, when we talk about this genuine happiness, one of the very first things that you hear is often you have to enter into the path towards genuine happiness, you have to develop what's called in English renunciation. And then often people mistakenly think renunciation, meaning to give up, to renounce, I have to give up my pleasure if I want to find genuine happiness. That actually, as a good Buddhist, it's not right to enjoy pleasurable things. I have to give them up. Complete misunderstanding. Whether or not we have pleasurable experiences is not the point. What renunciation is really talking about is giving up an unhealthy attitude towards our pleasurable experiences. Now, often our attitude is pleasure equals happiness. So therefore, I need more pleasure. More pleasure means more happiness. So therefore, we often end up with craving and attachment to pleasurable experiences. But that's not going to get us anywhere except more suffering. So renunciation is about giving up that craving and attachment for pleasure. So actually what you will find, it's not a choice. It's not like either pleasure or genuine happiness. And if we strive for genuine happiness, the byproduct actually is we'll enjoy our pleasurable experiences much more than we do now. So actually it's a win-win situation. So again, here when we talk about striving for happiness, particularly genuine happiness, this is not really determined about what happens to us. Because actually we've got very little control over what happens to us. And so if we're basing our happiness on what happens to us, we're in trouble. Rather, here, genuine happiness is not so much what happens to us, but it's more about how we respond to what happens to us. That's going to determine happiness or suffering. And what we're going to find in this evening's talk is that mindfulness is a key element in helping us to better respond to what happens to us. And so what we're going to see is that mindfulness is a key element in both types of happiness, temporal and genuine happiness. And you notice in the title of the talk, it says mindfulness, a key to happiness. It doesn't say mindfulness, the key to happiness. Unfortunately, in the modern world, in a lot of these modern mindfulness traditions, that's often how it's presented. And usually in these modern traditions, mindfulness is, they get the idea of mindfulness often from Buddhist context. And they go, that mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition, that looks good, that looks useful, but you know, all that other stuff there in Buddhism, that's that religious stuff. We don't want that, so let's throw that out. So then they grab mindfulness, pull it out, and then they say, then it becomes this mindfulness pill. Just take the mindfulness pill and all your problems will go away. They won't go away. In fact, if you have bare mindfulness, what you've really done is you've stripped away all the things that make mindfulness effective. So then mindfulness loses its ability to transform because you've stripped away the whole framework. And so then what you end up with is, someone coined this term some years ago, mindfulness, like McDonald's. Fast food mindfulness, not very healthy mindfulness. That's what we end up in a lot of modern day mindfulness traditions. And it's not healthy for us, like fast food is not healthy for us. In fact, not only won't it make all your problems go away, but if you take the mindfulness pill and you have already a dysfunctional lifestyle, what might actually happen is that could amplify your dysfunctional lifestyle and cause you even more suffering. And we see this sometimes in these traditions. So therefore, if we want mindfulness to be transformative, to be a key, we need framework. Does it have to be Buddhist framework? No, but it needs a framework. Mindfulness on its own is not the magic pill. It's not going to solve all your problems. And we're going to look a little bit later in the presentation, what does this framework look like? Particularly when we're striving for genuine happiness, we need a framework. Otherwise, mindfulness is not going to get us anywhere near genuine happiness. So let's first look, though, at how mindfulness is a key to temporal happiness. Let's first see what a lack of mindfulness brings us. And generally, in terms of temporal happiness, our view is that the source of happiness and suffering is out there. That person or that thing is the source of my suffering. That person or thing is the source of my happiness. And that idea, together with a lack of mindfulness, leads to a lot of problems. First, of course, is then with this view and a lack of mindfulness, we end up with craving and attachment to pleasant things, pleasurable experiences, because they seem to be the source of our happiness. And then similarly, we end up with aversion to unpleasant experiences, because those unpleasant experiences seem to be the source of my suffering. So let's get away from them, get them out of here. And on the basis of those, we also end up getting caught up in our thoughts and emotions. And often if our thoughts and emotions are not very pleasant and we don't know how to deal with them, what do? We try and suppress them. So we end up following and suppressing thoughts and emotions. We get caught up in a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking, get caught up in our emotions, and big mess. And this lack of mindfulness also even leads to unethical behavior. You know, often when we react in this way, we end up saying and doing things that we later regret because we weren't mindful at the time. We just reacted, and then afterwards go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. So this unethical behavior happens a lot because of a lack of mindfulness. So let's see what mindfulness can do about this. So again, with a lack of mindfulness, particularly together with this idea that the source of happiness and suffering is out there, then when we have pleasant stimulus, pleasant experience, we end up, of course, with craving and attachment for that person or thing that seems to be the source of our happiness. And with that comes a lot of other things. With that often comes worry or anxiety about not getting it, frustration when we don't get it, overindulging when we do get it, and then often a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when it doesn't live up to our expectations. And we simply end up craving for more because we mistakenly think the reason we're not satisfied is I just didn't get enough of it. I need more of that. And it's even worse than that, because craving and attachment is always looking for something bigger, better, and different. And we know this from our own experience. If we get the things we like too much, it doesn't take too long before attachment goes, boring, boring, not good enough anymore. I want something bigger, better, and different. And so we actually end up losing out on enjoying the things we used to because attachment thinks it's not good enough anymore. So what would happen if suddenly we had more mindfulness when it comes to these pleasant experiences? The first thing that would happen is we would reduce our attachment. Because with mindfulness, we would be simply present, fully present with that pleasurable experience. Because it's our conceptual mind of attachment which is causing the problem. But if we are simply present in the direct experience of that pleasurable experience, then we're in a direct experience, we're more out of the conceptual mind, which is causing the which is the attachment is arising. So what you will find is that if you are mindful of those pleasant experiences, there's less possibility for craving and attachment to arise. So it would reduce our attachment. Thereby, of course, we would have less suffering. The suffering that comes from worry, anxiety, frustration, disappointment, and so on, and overindulging. All of those things would be reduced, so our pleasant experiences would result in much less suffering than they do now. And we would enjoy our pleasurable experiences much more than we do now. And to highlight that, I'd like to give a concrete example from my own experience. Many years ago, when I did my first long meditation retreat, I was in Spain. I was on the side of a mountain in a retreat centre, and I was there for 8 months. And the retreat centre was providing meals. So they brought a basket each day near my hut. I picked up the basket. Nutritional food, but basically it was the same menu every week. We know from our own experience, if we eat the same food week after week, it doesn't take too many weeks before we go, oof, not that again. Even if it's something we normally like. My experience was exact opposite. After about 4 weeks of eating the same food, it started tasting better. I was convinced the cook was putting more effort into the cooking, maybe extra spices or something, wasn't sure, but it definitely was tasting better. Another couple of weeks went by, it kept tasting better. But then after about 6 or 7 weeks, I realized this is exactly the same food as 6 weeks ago. What was happening was, due to being in meditation retreat, the mind calming down, craving and attachment are calming down, which meant I was more present with the experience of eating the food. I was enjoying the food much more. In fact, I've never enjoyed food that much ever before in my life. Not only that, I was in a retreat hut on the side of the mountain, beautiful spacious view, Mediterranean in the distance. Again, though, if we're in a place that has a very nice view, it doesn't take too many days of being there when we don't notice it anymore. It just becomes boring. But my experience was the view kept getting more and more and more beautiful. And even little tiny things, a little insignificant flower was after a month or 6 weeks, wow, that's so beautiful. So my experience was that by reducing my craving and attachment, by being more mindful, I was enjoying pleasurable experiences much more than I've ever done before in my life. So this is what will happen if we improve our mindfulness in terms of pleasant experiences. What about unpleasant experiences? How will mindfulness affect our unpleasant experiences? So at the moment, of course, due to a lack of mindfulness, together particularly with the view, source of suffering is out there. When we're faced with an unpleasant experience, what do? We react with aversion. I don't like that, go away. We try and push away from it. So what does that aversion do? It simply magnifies the level of suffering we experience. And then often that can lead to unethical behavior. And this idea that this aversion magnifies and distorts was very clearly highlighted in another study, a study that I read about recently. What they did was they had a group of people, and each person had something like a heat pad on their leg that was producing a lot of heat. So it was quite painful on the leg. And they asked the participants to continually tell them their level of pain. And the scale was 0 up to 100. So then initially the average was they were experiencing a level of pain of 66. At the same time as the heat pad, they had an intravenous drip in their arm. And initially it was just saline solution going in, so nothing in particular. Then what they did was they started introducing painkiller without telling the people. But they kept asking them, what's the level of pain? So you would expect the level should go down. And it did. It went from 66 to 55. But then, still painkiller, but now the only thing that changed was they told them they were getting painkiller. So magically, it went from 55 to 39. Now's the interesting part. 39. Now, they kept giving them painkiller, but now they told them they're stopping the painkiller, expect pain. So nothing changed, but now instead of reporting 39, they were reporting 64. So what we can see there is a lot of the suffering they were experiencing was through aversion. So therefore, a lack of mindfulness often leads to aversion, and what happens is the amount of suffering we experience from unpleasant situations is magnified many-fold. Again, an example from my own experience. Well, actually, I'll give it coming up. So if we are mindful of unpleasant experiences, what will happen? Our our aversion will reduce, because again, we'll simply be present with that experience. Conceptual mind will not be more activated and having this aversion. So therefore, less aversion, and less aversion means less suffering. And here's another example from my own experience. Many years ago, one of the very first things I did when I came into Buddhism, I did one of these 10-day Goenka Vipassana retreats. And just before I did that retreat, I'd hurt my knee in a sporting accident. So sitting cross-legged, I could maybe manage 15 minutes and then the knee started to hurt and then I had to keep shifting. But in this retreat, partway through, you had these particular sessions each day. They called it, I think, something like strong determination. You have to sit still for 1 hour, don't move. So I was determined, sit still. And at that time, the practice was to scan the body for sensations. And the part of the instruction was, if you got to a part of the body that had strong sensations, just stay there a bit longer. So of course I was scanning down, and when I got to the right knee, immense pain. I mean, it was overwhelming suffering I was experiencing, overwhelming. But when I got to the knee, if I had mindfulness, that strong singular pain started breaking up into smaller bits of pain. And if I had good mindfulness, what happened was that broke up into just thousands of intense sensations, which actually were pleasant. And I could happily sit there, no problem. Of course, it was signaling to me, pay attention, something you need to attend to. Soon as my mindfulness went and the conceptual mind kicked in, what's that? Ah, that's pain, I don't like that, go away. Soon as the aversion kicked in, overwhelming suffering. In that case, I could confidently say more than 95% of the suffering I was experiencing was self-induced through aversion. So if we can cultivate mindfulness to unpleasant stimulus, particularly if we have good mindfulness, the amount of suffering we experience dramatically reduces. Also, what will happen we will have more resilience for unpleasant experiences. Because the lack of aversion will be able to sit with these unpleasant experiences, which means that we'll be able to, over time, be able to be present with those unpleasant experiences more and more and more increase, without having the aversion and so forth. What about thoughts and emotions? Because with lack of mindfulness, we tend to get caught up in our thoughts and emotions. In fact, I think in the modern day world, so much so, we have a lot of this OCD, obsessive compulsive thinking. In our modern society, it's epidemic. We're overwhelmed by our thoughts and emotions. And again, one of the main reasons is lack of mindfulness. So what's going to happen if we develop mindfulness with respect to our thoughts and emotions? Now, of course, due to a lack of mindfulness, what happens is one of two things. A thought or an emotion comes up in our mind. The most common thing we do, latch onto it, off we go. And then we sort of get caught up in our stories and our emotions and memories. And then, of course, if it's unpleasant, we don't know what to do with that. So what do? We try and suppress it. So, in fact, we end up being overwhelmed by our thoughts and emotions. and we end up being the slaves of our mind. And of course, if we try to suppress these thoughts and emotions, they don't go away. It builds up like a pressure cooker. And often what happens is that manifests as a lot of physical problems in the body. And then we often project a lot of this negativity onto the people around us. And of course, every time we are following our thoughts and emotions or trying to suppress them, we're feeding the habit. So the habit of them coming up gets stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. So what's going to happen if now we become mindful of our thoughts and emotions? It will dramatically reduce our obsessive compulsive thinking. Because one of the things we do now is when our mind is churning over and over and over and over and over, and we don't like it, what do we try and do? We try and make our mind still. Not a good strategy. That's like throwing petrol on the fire. It's just going to get worse. Fighting with our mind is not going to work. We don't need to fight with our mind. All we need to do is step back and observe, watch. So all we need is mindfulness. If we can step back with mindfulness and just observe our thoughts and emotions and memories and all other mental events, just observe them arise and pass, then what's going to happen is that we are not feeding the habit. So over time, our mind will naturally become more quiet and still. So the amount of obsessive compulsive thinking will dramatically reduce, and thereby our mind will become calm. That our default mode won't be blah, 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 blah all day. It will be stillness. That will be our default mode. Also, of course, now, with a lack of mindfulness, we get overwhelmed by our thoughts and emotions and memories. We're the slaves of our mind. Through mindfulness, we'll become the masters of our mind. Because if we can observe thoughts and emotions and memories and so on, simply arising and passing, then we're not feeding the habit, which means the habit of them coming up will get weaker and weaker, so our mind will become more calm. But also what's going to happen is we now have the ability to observe them without getting caught up in them, without needing to suppress them. And so then in future, if some strong thought, emotion or memory were to arise, we could simply be present with it without it overwhelming us. Because if we look at what is a thought or emotion or memory from its own side, it's virtually nothing. Thoughts, emotions and memories have no power to harm us. Zero. They only have power if we give them power. And we give them power by identifying with them and following them or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. But if we don't identify with it and just observe them arise and pass, no matter how strong they are, they cannot harm us in any way. So we will become the masters of our mind instead of the slaves of our mind. And also, mindfulness of thoughts and emotions and memories will help us to heal the mind. Because healing, the first part of healing at least, is simply acknowledging these things. So often, if it's something negative, we're suppressing it. We're denying it. Simply allowing it to arise and pass, we're acknowledging it. And so often that in itself, if not healing, it's the beginning of the healing process. What about behavior? Now, of course, due to a lack of mindfulness, what often happens is that we react. And we react out of habit. Again, through the attachment and aversion, we often react, meaning we often say and do things that we later regret. And through that, what happens is often end up with guilt, low self-esteem and self-hatred, which again I think is often very epidemic in our modern society. So if we can simply be mindful of our behavior, of course then we can become more ethical, because again a lot of our unethical behavior is not so much premeditated, but rather it's reacting mindlessly. We just stimulus reaction. So certainly those we can reduce through being mindful. And also we can have better self-esteem. Now, of course, in our modern society, again, it seems to be this epidemic of low self-esteem, guilt and self-hatred. And a lot of that is due to a lack of mindfulness. Because just as we identify with thoughts and emotions and memories, we also identify with our behavior instinctively. So what happens, of course, is that when we engage in some harmful behavior, we identify with that, and suddenly we have become a bad person. But we are not our behavior. But thinking in this way is we've stuck them together. The person and behavior have become one thing. And in psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. It's a false perspective, invalid. Because there are two things here. There's a person and behavior. But we stick them together and we see ourselves as a bad person. And then, of course, what happens is guilt. Because guilt comes from this. If we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. Guilt is completely useless. All it does is it makes us feel bad, it paralyzes us. It's not even addressing the bad behavior. So we don't need to feel guilty about anything because it's based on a false, invalid